What are some of the main challenges facing comparative law today?
I think there are basically three kinds of challenges right now. One of them is a matter of self-perception. I think comparative law is perceived, is understood by comparative people in ways that are unnecessarily narrow. We think of ourselves still as doing one-on-one kinds of comparisons that you're actually just looking at a comparison. Why is one different from another? That's all fine, it's all valuable, it's all good, and so on. But it strikes me as unnecessarily narrow. We've got tools to do much more than that. There's a lot of reason to do more than that. We think of this as a one-on-one situation when the world has become multilateral. And my view is that we have to, or at least we should, add to the things we already do, the kinds of multilateral, multi-angled approaches that would be appropriate for now.
So you raised that there are three challenges facing comparative law. One is that it's unnecessarily narrow.
Right. And the second one of those, I think, would be the perception of others, right? It's related to the first one, but not necessarily the same thing. By thinking of this as a matter of one-on-one comparison, thinking of this as just a matter of relating, in some sense, one system to another system, or maybe a couple of systems, you miss an awful lot. You miss the kinds of things that could be methodologically useful to people outside of your community. If you have someone looking at what people do within comparative law now, what do they see? They say, well, there's some experts there. There's an expert in Russian law, and an expert in Spanish law, and an expert in Brazilian law. And they say, well, I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested in Brazil particularly, and I'm not interested in Spain and so forth, so the hell with it. I think what we want to be able to do is say, look, we've got some tools in this community. We've got some tools that we've used in many ways for hundreds of experiments, thousands maybe now. And we can use those much more broadly. If we focus on the tools that other people can see, then the perception of others will change, presumably, and it can become a platform for methods and tools and so on. We do all of these things, but we don't think very much about what we do in a way that is transferable. And I think that is a major challenge. And the third challenge is really is related to the first two, and that is the flood of information from globalization of technology and globalization of communications. We have no longer a situation where it's just limited information. Until fairly recently, until the 1990s anyway, comparative law people were valuable because they could get information nobody else had. They could translate it. They could look into things that people couldn't find. All that stuff is now available. Now the question is, how do you make it useful? How do you relate the pieces to each other? How do you effectively get at that sort of information? And how do you structure the data? And I don't think that we have a good sense of how to do that yet. And I think we have the tools at the base that can be used for that, but we haven't really started using them that way. And so that's, I think, a third challenge, and I think it is a fundamental one, right? We're in a world where there's a tremendous amount of data. Comparative law as a discipline that just looks at how you get information is unnecessarily narrow. We want to use the information and make it useful to others.
We've turned to the idea that there's certain challenges facing the profession, one of them being that there's a narrow methodological toolkit, possibly, and that needs to be enriched, both deepened and broadened. What sort of opportunities do you think, or directions do you think that should move in?
In my view, the way that we can sort of restructure our focus at least one way we can restructure our focus to make it more useful to others and to make it more valuable in the current context, is to think about what we do as the crossing of borders more generally. We have a tremendous set of potential points of entry into the global conversation. There's a tremendous amount of information, and at each point, basically, there's a crossing of borders. There's a crossing of borders linguistically, sociologically, between legal systems. And if we think of what we do, comparative law has been about crossing borders in the past, but only narrowly. Now we can say the tools that we have used in the past in these very relatively narrow situations can be used to cross borders much more broadly. We just have to figure out how to expand that. We've got the tools in a sort of not primitive form, that's a little bit too narrow, but we have tools that are not used to the fullest extent. So one of the things we can begin to do is think about this as a matter of decision theory. How do you cross borders? What kinds of things happen when you cross borders? What kinds of decisions do you make when you cross borders? And if we start thinking about what we do from that angle, creates, I think, tremendous opportunities. We also have right now in the comparative law community, I think, a tremendous opportunity in terms of people. We have not only the questioner here, John Haskell, but we have lots of others lots of people in the society itself, and some not in the society, who know some things, who are valuable already, who have energy and the desire to do the kinds of things which I think are necessary to have done. And if we can exploit that, if we can capture that energy and that vision and that imagination among the younger generation and do it in a way that focuses on, as I say, crossing of borders, that is a combination that I think could be very, very valuable, not only for the people involved, but for comparative law as a discipline, and I think for much broader context, right? If we're talking about globalization and crossing borders all the time, and we have better tools for doing that, whether we're practitioners or judges or administrators, the more effectively we can cross those borders, and with a better sense of what the impact is, we can provide a lot of value for society.
So, what would you like to accomplish as president of the American Society of Comparative Law, especially with reimagining this thought community?
Yeah. I think the American Society of Comparative Law is particularly well positioned right now. I mean, we've got a group of young people, including yourself, of course, and I could name names, but I guess we won't bother to do that right now. But certainly some young people who are developing some of these ideas, moving in this direction. Then there are a bunch of other people, I think, in the society and outside the society who are sort of wondering, all right, is this going to go anywhere? Is this going to be valuable? Should I devote my career to doing these kinds of things? And I think we're right now at a position where if we give support and recognition to the people who are in that group, the younger scholars, and the Younger Scholars Committee has been a fabulous addition to what we do over the last couple of years with the tremendous leadership. And so I think we've got that general movement. And then I would think there are a couple of other, a little bit more specific sorts of things one can think about. I've set up some initiatives of outreach. I think if we're talking about being able to cross borders, then let's take some examples and start exploring that. So we've got one committee that's just been formed on outreach to Latin America. The idea there will be let's bring in this element. We've got a continent to the south we pay very little attention to in the comparative law community. There's absolutely no reason why we can't do much more with that group. Now we have digital technology, we can have them participate in ways that they couldn't have done before. The linguistic issue is interesting because Spanish, of course, is somewhat accessible to to quite a number of people. And so we can think about the linguistic element. We can think about the sociological element as we bring all of this in. And as we bring that in, that kind of data, that kind of information experience can tremendously enrich what we do and hopefully enrich what they do. We've got one committee that just set up outreach to Asia. And the linguistic component here is much trickier, of course. Not many people have many linguistic ties to Asia. A few do. And then we have the issue of, well, if it's not going to be dealing with the linguistic border directly, it'll be dealing with the linguistic border indirectly in the fact that they have to speak English essentially for our purposes. So that's a different kind of border. It's a what I call a black box border, but it is a border nevertheless. So we can explore that, and by bringing the people in, trying to establish the connections, we can start seeing how this is going to work. And the third outreach we have is to the social sciences. We've got a committee that's just been formed a couple of weeks ago, and we have just a wonderful committee of people. Some of whom are in the American Society of Comparative Law. Some of whom are not. Top scholars and creative scholars who are thinking about these kinds of things from sociology and political science and so on. And we've now put that together. They're going to come up with a report in September. I'm hoping and I expect this will happen. And again, we were crossing the borders into these disciplines. And what happens? What kinds of incentives are there to do that? What happens when you do that? Those kinds of things are critical, and we need to make an effort to understand the borders and then try to go beyond them. So if we think about it as a matter of crossing borders and we look at these kinds of outreach potentials, then I think we get someplace.
Moving from the more general community just to your own scholarship, a lot of these dynamics are hinted at in your work to date, but it seems like this is a direction your own scholarship's moving in?
Well, it certainly is certainly something that I've been trying to do, and in a variety of ways, and hope we'll get a little bit further as we go along here. A couple of things that I'm trying to do. For example, I have one major project that is writing a global guide to a particular area of law. So if we think of the world and the legal world, and we look at areas of law, and it could be family law, it could be antitrust law, whatever it is, and you say, if I'm going to operate in that area, make decisions in that area, I should be able to think about this from a perspective that is broader than my own system, okay? Well, then it would be very helpful to know what sort of perspective you would have. If you don't have the perspective, if you don't start with your own system and just add questions about what a foreign law is, and you want to really see interrelationships among systems, interrelationships among actors within systems, institutions within systems, then presumably we need to have, or would be valuable to have, a guide that is designed specifically to provide that. And so that's what I'm hoping to. I have a manuscript that hopefully will be finished by the end of the year. Oxford has said that they want to publish this. And it will be the first time they have tried to have a global guide and introduction to a field of law. And the editors at Oxford say that they think this could be the kind of thing that a lot of areas will be followed in a lot of areas. And I think that has great implications because it involves, well, how do you think about this from a global perspective? What do you do? And this isn't the place to go into what I'm actually doing there, but you have to start thinking, well, what are the boundaries that are inherent somehow, that are given by the nature of the problem? And then you ask, well, how do other systems deal with that? And can we find patterns instead of dealing? We've got tremendous data out there, huge amounts of data, overwhelming amounts of data. And if we don't know how to filter the data, then we can't often do very much with it, or at least whatever we do is likely to be fairly inefficient. But if we have a guide that shows the patterns, provides, it's specifically designed to bring you into an area from a global perspective. That is to say, this is not an American or French lawyer looking at this. This is somebody trying to say, I'm going to look at this from a global perspective so that I can see the patterns, so I can see the dynamics, so I can see the relationships. Then that ought to be enormously valuable. I think it is anyway, and I guess the proof will be, as they say in the quote, pudding, unquote. But I think that has tremendous capacity, tremendous potential. I'm doing a couple other smaller things that are trying to relate it as well. For example, I'm doing a shorter piece on global supply chains. From a purely technical legal angle, that may seem like a fairly narrow issue, maybe. But all of us, basically the world is being structured by global supply chains, global value chains, the economics world anyway. And we don't have much of a handle on that from the legal side. And if we try to view this more globally, how do we think about this? It's just a matter of the extension. Most of what has happened in the American legal world dealing with this is just trying to subsume it into prior categories. But in fact, these global supply chains are very different from the normal, what we had in the past. So trying to think about that as a global phenomenon, how you deal with it as a global phenomenon, how you think about how one can think about it in ways that are more productive than we've been thinking about it so far. Then I'm trying to do something on what I call decision theory. I've had a little bit of writing on this before, done a little bit of writing on this before, but I think I need to really work out the theory more carefully. But the point again is, if we're talking about crossing borders, then you have to make decisions how you cross borders, and then you have to figure out, well, what information do you need to do that? And I've got, I think, a useful approach to this, but I have to work it out more carefully. So hopefully, I'll have a chance to do that. And then the final sort of bigger project is to hopefully have time to do a book that ties this all together. How do we cross borders on a global level from a legal standpoint? So those are the things that I'm trying to do.